In the stillness of a dimly lit room, where the ticking of a clock is the only evidence of time's passage, there exists a feeling that is both familiar and haunting. It creeps not in moments of solitude, but in the vast emptiness that surrounds the soul even when others are near. This condition, often mistaken for mere isolation, is what I shall call loneliness, not of the external world, but of the psyche itself. One may walk through crowded streets, dine with companions, even exchange laughter with strangers, yet feel as though they are wading through an endless fog, unheard, unseen, untouched. What is this quiet ache that seeps into the unconscious like ink into water? Why does the individual, so biologically and socially engineered to connect, often find himself adrift in an emotional desert, parched of meaning, yet overwhelmed by sensation? You see, loneliness is not a simple absence of company. It is the profound absence of understanding. It is the subconscious realization that one's innermost thoughts, dreams, and fears exist in a chamber to which no other holds the key. In my years studying the depths of the human psyche, I have found that loneliness is not merely an emotional byproduct, but a fundamental experience of being. It is interwoven with our early development, the forging of our identity, and the fragmented relationships we inherit and create. Today, we embark on a journey into the unconscious, not to cure loneliness in its entirety, for that would be foolish, but to understand it, to unmask it, and to speak to it as one might speak to a forgotten part of themselves. For in understanding, there is a kind of healing. To comprehend the origins of loneliness, one must peer backward, not merely into the circumstances of adulthood, but deeper still, into the architecture of the psyche built during the earliest moments of life. In the cradle, where needs are not yet spoken but cried out, the child begins its first negotiation with the external world. If the cry is met with warmth and nourishment, a foundation of trust is laid. But if the response is cold, delayed, or inconsistent, the infant begins to internalize a subtle terror that the world may not echo back when it calls. Thus is planted the seed of loneliness. It is not just about being physically alone. It is about feeling emotionally unreceived. As the child grows, this primal blueprint evolves. The boy ignored by a distracted father, the girl who fears her affection will be punished or misunderstood, the adolescent forced to suppress their true self to gain acceptance. Each begins to build an identity not from authentic being, but from adaptation and defense. These adaptations, while functional in the outer world, create a schism within. One part of the self performs, another part watches from the shadows, unseen. Loneliness, then, is not a lack of people. It is the result of a divided self. One smiles, the other grieves. One speaks while the other remains silent inside. Even in relationships, we may feel lonely because the part of us that longs to be known is never truly revealed. Or worse, when it is dismissed or misunderstood. We fear rejection so much that we often exile the most intimate parts of ourselves, and in doing so, we reject our own need for connection. The ego, in its effort to maintain coherence, builds defenses, rationalization, repression, avoidance. But the unconscious knows. It remembers the unspoken pain, the emotional exiles, the false performances. And so, even amidst social connection, the psyche whispers, "You are still alone." To move forward, we must acknowledge this truth. Loneliness is not cured by company. Alone, it is cured by authenticity. But before we explore the path to healing, we must examine the lens through which I, Freud, once viewed this enigma, and the methods I employed to understand the silent cries of the mind. To Freud, the mind was a theater, its curtains woven of memories, instincts, and suppressed desires, where loneliness did not stand alone, but was always a companion to conflict. he did not treat loneliness as a mere feeling, but rather as a manifestation of psychic tension, a cry from the unconscious that the self was fractured and disjointed. In his view, the origins of such disconnection were rarely found in the present. They were buried in the strata of early life, in repressed desires, abandoned needs, and forbidden longings. At the heart of Freud's theory was the idea of the divided self. The id, primal and impulsive, longs for connection, warmth, and union. It does not tolerate separation. The ego, navigating the real world, learns the limits of closeness, contorts itself to meet expectations, and manages disappointment. And then comes the superego, that stern, internalized voice of parents, culture, and morality, which often condemns the very needs that would bring us into intimacy. Loneliness for Freud was not merely sadness, it was often guilt. The guilt of wanting too much, of needing deeply, of fearing our desires are unworthy or shameful. He observed how patients, while speaking of their emptiness or isolation, would unconsciously resist vulnerability. In the therapy room, they would talk around their pain, intellectualize it, or joke through it, defense mechanisms, as he termed them. But behind these defenses were childhood wounds. A mother who withheld affection unless the child pleased her. A father whose anger taught the child to hide their needs. Loneliness, then, was often a consequence of attachment distorted by fear, the fear of being too much or not enough. Through free association, Freud invited patients to let the unconscious speak freely. In dreams, he found clues, symbols of abandonment, empty rooms, distant figures, closed doors, each metaphor echoing an unmet need. In slips of the tongue and seemingly trivial memories, he uncovered desires that had long been buried, but not forgotten. Most telling was his insight that people often repeat what hurt them. A lonely child might become the adult who chooses emotionally distant partners, not because they want isolation, but because the familiar pain is safer than unknown vulnerability. This repetition compulsion, Freud warned, was the psyche's tragic attempt to rewrite the story, but often it only reinforced it. To Freud, healing loneliness was not about seeking new friends or romantic partners. It was about unearthing the past, understanding the internal drama, and reconciling the inner voices at war. Only when the repressed was brought to light could the self find wholeness, and perhaps genuine connection. But how does one begin this process? How do we move from mere awareness to transformation? Let us now explore the path to tackling this deeply embedded human ache. To address loneliness through Freud's lens is not to patch a surface crack. It is to descend into the unconscious, to unearth what the conscious mind dares not speak. Freud never promised quick fixes. His path was not one of motivational quotes or shallow affirmations, but of excavation, slow, sometimes painful, often illuminating. Tackling loneliness, then, begins not with changing the world outside, but with confronting the world within. The first step is radical honesty, not to others, but to the self. What is it we truly fear about being alone? Is it the silence, or what we hear within it? Is it the absence of others, or the parts of ourselves we meet in solitude? Freud taught that we defend ourselves against our own truths, often unconsciously. The lonely person might say, "I just need to meet the right people," when in fact they carry a deep belief that they are unlovable or fundamentally flawed. Until these internal beliefs are made conscious, they shape our reality. The act of remembering, Freud believed, was not merely nostalgic, it was therapeutic. To tackle loneliness, one must often return to the first time they felt rejected, the first time they learned to hide, to perform, to please. These are not just memories, they are blueprints. And unless examined, we follow them blindly. Freud's technique of free association, speaking freely without censorship, remains powerful. Whether in therapy or in solitude with a journal, the process of allowing thoughts to spill unfiltered can reveal surprising patterns. Repeated themes, metaphors, and fears begin to surface, and in those, we find the roots of our isolation. Another Freudian approach is to observe the defense mechanisms. Do we retreat into intellectualism? Do we joke to deflect emotion? Do we chase chaotic relationships to avoid stillness? Noticing these is not about self-blame, it is about reclaiming awareness, because when defenses are exposed, they lose their grip, and then comes mourning. For Freud, healing often involved grief, not just of lost people, but of lost parts of the self. We must mourn the child who didn't feel safe, the needs that were silenced, the years spent performing for love. Only in mourning can we begin to let go of old patterns. Loneliness then is not a curse, it is a messenger. It tells us that somewhere within we have become estranged from our own desires, our own vulnerability, our own humanity. By facing it, understanding it, and listening to it without judgment, we begin not only to feel less lonely, but to become whole. Loneliness, in the end, is not merely a state, it is a shadow. It walks beside the ego, quietly whispering of needs unmet, truths unspoken, selves forgotten. In Freud's world, nothing is accidental. Even the ache of isolation carries meaning. It is not weakness. It is not failure. It is the psyche calling back to the individual, urging them to reconcile the split between what they are and what they were forced to become. If there is one Freudian truth that echoes louder than the rest, it is this: we are not always who we think we are. Beneath our everyday identity lies a labyrinth of suppressed impulses, forgotten wounds, and displaced longings. Loneliness is often the cry of that buried self, desperate for recognition, not from the world, but from the person who hosts it. Freud did not romanticize suffering. He acknowledged it as a reality of human existence, but not one without meaning. He taught us to sit with discomfort, to question its origin, and to trace it back to its roots. Loneliness, viewed through this psychoanalytic lens, becomes a trail, one that leads back not to others, but to the fragments of ourselves we've abandoned in exchange for acceptance, approval, and survival. The modern world urges distraction. Loneliness makes us reach for screens, for noise, for anything but stillness. But Freud would have said, let the silence speak. Let it unveil the repressed, the infantile, the symbolic. Let it point us not outward, but inward, toward integration. Because only when we face ourselves fully do we become ready to truly face others. And so, we do not escape loneliness by running from it. We transcend it by listening to it, by decoding its message, by holding space for our own complexity. Perhaps then loneliness is not our enemy. Perhaps, as Freud might quietly suggest, it is our most honest companion, showing us where the healing must begin.